The private sector is increasingly being seen by development actors as a key partner for achieving development results. It is being recognized that private firms are sources of innovation, expertise, and investments that need to be harnessed if development challenges are to be addressed. Their innovative capacity goes beyond innovation in technology, processes, products, and services, to include innovations aimed at improving their social and environmental impact. Many private sector actors are going beyond their regular business operations and actively pursuing innovative business strategies and inclusive, sustainable business models aimed at maximizing profits while contributing to development. Recent studies show that South-South foreign direct investment typically reaches very poor and remote developing countries. This is because of private sector's ability to adapt to the demand and the environment of the countries in which they operate. They then use innovative business models developed in one emerging market and replicate them in other countries in the region. These business models and technologies are often more attuned to the needs and conditions in developing countries. South-South investments in Asia and the Pacific can also increase bilateral and regional trade with the potential to generate more jobs and bring down the cost of goods and services, making them more affordable for the poor. In the process, people are trained and exposed to new techniques and know-how, contributing to the assimilation and utilization of knowledge. Effective interaction and dialogue between the government, the private sector, the civil society, and other development actors play a key role in creating a coherent policy framework, knowledge sharing, capacity, and technical cooperation. Strategic efforts to share knowledge and technical expertise might present new opportunities for improved development outcomes.
We've been talking since this morning a lot about the role of different actors, the government, the NGOs, and other publics or civil society, but the private sector, as was mentioned during the presentation of the video, the video is a really important player in development. Without the private sector, we all know that there is no way governments can achieve the SDGs that have been put in place. The private sector is going to be a key actor, and a key actor also in knowledge sharing. So what we are going to discuss in this panel is the role of the private sector in boosting the knowledge sharing across countries in the region. And for that, we have representatives from the government, from an MDB, from KDI, and more importantly, from the private sector itself. And we'd like to have that perspective on how the private sector is seeing itself in this role of knowledge sharing. I suggest that I will organize the session in 3 rounds of questions. The first round of questions will be at a general level, asking each one of the panelists about their perspective of the role of the private sector in South-South knowledge sharing. Of course, each one with its own specific experience and perspective as a background. The second round of questions would be more focused on concrete examples, coming from their also experience of how the private sector is improving knowledge sharing in the region. And the last round will be more looking forward. And the questions will be more about their recommendation, what can be done better, how we can work together, private sector, government, MDBs, civil society, to make sure that this sharing of knowledge happens. So I will start the first question with the private sector. So Shuri, yes, please. You work in a company that's in a variety of sectors, education, skills development, but also infrastructure. And you have experienced also the role of the private sector in sharing knowledge. So what is your perspective about this role? Why is the private sector an actor in this South-South knowledge sharing, and how?
Well, thank you, Veronique. Well, as private sector, I think the way we are structured as an institution, by definition, we have a risk appetite. We go out in the market and we try out new ideas. Some succeed, many of it fails, but more importantly, what happens is in that process, a lot of IP and knowledge gets generated. So I think that is one significant contribution of private sector in this entire initiative. Now, if we look at, there are multiple models where private sector can engage in this knowledge dissemination. Couple of principles for South-South region finds more significance. One is the approach of public, private, and community participation. There are some good examples of solutions working at scale, which can be applied, where knowledge can be generated through that. And since this region works in a comparatively resource constraining environment, so the innovation has to be frugal in nature. If we apply these two matrices, I think this across multiple sectors, be it core infrastructure or in farm and agri, health, telemedicine, education, vocational, we can think of all the areas of application. These principles has a value in it. And importantly, another key player in this is the startup. Is something which is emerging fairly well in some of the Asian countries. That ecosystem needs to be nurtured through innovative financing, and a partnership between private sector and startup also can give that startup who is an originator of IP a bigger access to market. These are 4 or 5 areas I think private sector has a role to play. But lastly, I think there is a lot to learn from Korea and the private sector companies like LG, Samsung, or a Hyundai. As an individual, I end up using a LG phone and watch television on Samsung, and I drive a Hyundai car. So there has to be something which the private sector in Korea is doing right in terms of technology or the market approach, making it hyper-local. There is a lot to learn from that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think actually Kuwan will be well positioned to give us some concrete example on how we can definitely learn from what the private sector is doing right and the government together actually in Korea. It's interesting that you mentioned the startup work, because there is also another trend of the private sector, which is to look more and more beyond, of course, the legitimate objective of making money and profit, which is the role and the responsibility of the private sector and job creation. There is also more and more trend of looking at also how the private sector can be part of the generation of public goods. And startups are actually also more and more in percentage actually looking at maybe impact investments or social entrepreneurship. That's another dimension of how the private sector can actually influence the knowledge sharing. Let me turn to Raman now. You are from the public sector in Bangladesh, and you've been also exposed to a lot of experience in infrastructure, in energy sector, in the garment sector. In general, before the next round where you will give us some specific examples, what is your perspective on the role of the private sector in sharing knowledge within a country and across countries?
Well, thank you, Veronique. Well, these days, government no longer is the main entrepreneur. So the main engine of development is the private sector, which is responsible for ensuring growth, creating jobs. They pay taxes, which on the contrary, government again uses as investment. Now, an Australian survey shows that in the Indo-Pacific nations, 90% of the jobs are in the private sector, not in the public sector. 60% investment are there in the private sector, and more than 80% government revenues come from the private sector. So at present, we can say that private sector is the leading entrepreneur and the leading part where the future lies. So we have to agree with that. And the thing is that if we concentrate on improving the living standard of the mass people. So again, it has to be private sector and cooperation with the private sector. Now, there are some good examples and some bad incidents, but the good examples are they make us hopeful about the future. Like, government has a key role to play. Government can help in through policy making. Government can initiate and encourage, but again, it's the private sector who has to come up. For an example, now there are if there is a policy which is export oriented, open and helpful for the market development, then private sector is going to flourish. On the contrary, it would actually reduce the burden of the government for good governance. So in this way, private sector is has been doing tremendously well in this part of the globe. Now, for an example, if we pick some example from Bangladesh, around 75% of the GDP in the 7th five-year plan comes from the private sector, not from the public sector. The major sources are RMG, pharmaceuticals, tea, leather, and electricity produce. Like 5 to 10 years back, Bangladesh had been suffering from energy restraint, which has been successfully combated and faced by the government through quick rental power plants. And the government basically is still responsible for maintaining infrastructure, energy, and some other major services. So other than that, it is the private sector which is still kept open for development. Now, for an example, in RMG, Bangladesh has developed in such a level that it's next to China in terms of export. But again, the journey was not that smooth, and it had different phases. Probably you all in this room have heard, and still it might be fresh in your memory, the Rana tragedy. So the tragedy where a garments factory collapsed, killing its workers. Now from then on, the government cooperations with the private sector, the buyers, donor agencies, actually helped to face the situation, and the situation is reversed, and there is much improvement at present, which ultimately improved the living conditions of the workers, at the same time earning good name for the factories and the country as well. So this is the way how private sector can really contribute to the development and growth of a nation.
Okay, thank you, Raman. And actually, we can come back in the second round on this example of the government sector in Bangladesh, where there is definitely a lot of transfer of knowledge, of technology, because of the investment from one country to another in the region. Still on this broader perspective of the role of the private sector in sharing knowledge in South, I will turn to Gambhir and ask, oh no, sorry, actually I was planning to finish with Gambhir, so I will turn to you, Kiwan, and ask you about your experience in Korea. Korea is, as we said since this morning, has been well known for its incredible growth, mainly based actually a lot on knowledge, education, and on private sector. So from this experience of Korea, what would you say is key in ensuring that the private sector is part of this South-South knowledge sharing? What is its role?
Yes, thank you very much, Veronique. My name is Kiwan Kim from the KDI PMAC, and it's a great pleasure to be a panelist in this session. And actually, I'm working in infrastructure area. So the center is KDI PMAC, and its main mandate is to conduct evaluation and also providing technical advices to the government in terms of the traditional procurement and the PPP project. So I'll start my intervention with some general observations on the economic growth of the countries. So not only Korea, but also the many countries have observed that the market economy and the private sector is the key driver forces of the sustained economic growth. And so maybe as you mentioned, the developmental state can play a pivotal role in the takeoff phase of the development, but the way in the way of the development, the market economy should be strengthened, and also more innovations and or creativity from the market economy should be put forward the economic growth of the country. So I think the two aspects, dimensions, are very important in terms of the role of the private sector. One is creativity, and the other is the efficiency. That does not mean the public sector or the governments cannot be the efficient or the creative. They can be creative and also the efficient, but the huge potential of the private sector that bring more efficiency and creativity to the general economy should be also the untapped. So that is some general observations. And in terms of the infrastructure financing, so in Korea we have utilized the potential of the public-private partnership very intensively. The PPP, the public-private partnership, is a kind of the general scheme where the public parties and private parties take part in for the realization of the specific project, and where the risks are allocated between different parties. And so in this the PPP scheme, we have also used the creativity and also efficiency as two dimensions that can contribute to the more effective implementation of the infrastructure financing. That are some of the lessons from the Korea.
Thank you, and we'll be happy to listen to you about concrete example of public-private partnerships in a few moments. I will turn to Gambier now about the experience of MDBs, like the Asian Development Bank. Of course, ADB is very much involved in supporting private sector investment in the region, but also supporting the role of the private sector in development. And some of our activities have been more focused on helping the private sector to disseminate knowledge across the region. So can you tell us more about this role of ADB in promoting exchange of knowledge of Asia's private sector? And would you consider this as one added value of ADB or an additionality of ADB?
Yeah. Thanks, Veronique. Before I respond to that, can I basically put this in proper perspective, because you may or may not have got the numbers. Look, there are sustainable development goals. There's been assessments done to find out how much money it's going to cost, resources, for all these countries to actually, to be able to achieve the SDGs. ADB's assessment was that just on infrastructure alone, for just Asia Pacific, we need $1.7 trillion just on infrastructure and just for Asia Pacific. And look, there's only going to be so much money that's going to come from abroad in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment. And much of it is going to go to countries like PRC and India and so on. There's only so much money that's going to come in ODA from official development assistance, because that's been declining over the years, by and large. So the countries have to come up with some way of coming up with these resources. ADB's investment, last year, as I said, we did $32.2 billion altogether, about $16 billion in infrastructure. That's just a drop in the bucket. So we need to find resources. The whole idea of this tax initiative was to see where we could find more resources. And countries have now come to the realization that the private sector is actually where the bulk of this will be coming from. Ergo, there's a need to really start thinking about how to bring the private sector more to work with the government, either to help them do whatever it is that they're doing in that particular areas of work, or of course to work with the government as well. Now that realization is also very strong in ADB. We have a separate private sector operations department. There's now a clear realization that we need to get the private sector much more on board with the kind of work that we do on the sovereign side, meaning lending to governments. And in doing all that, there's also a realization that we need to help the private sector in terms of the sharing of knowledge, because these are experiences that the private sector companies have in these various countries, and they can be applied across different countries. We have something called the Pacific Private Sector Initiative, PPSI. which actually looks at how the private sector in 14 Pacific countries can actually learn from the experiences of each, and then to see how much of that can actually be transferred across. Now, one of the key things we've learned, of course, is that you cannot take something that works in one country and just pass it on to the next. It doesn't go lock, stock, and barrel. You have to look at the country context. But ADB's work right now in terms of the private sector, in terms of knowledge sharing, has largely been centered around how do we work with the private sector, and largely in countries it's through the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. If you look at Bhutan, for example, I don't know if there's anybody here from Bhutan, but the BNCCI, the Bhutan National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, it's actually an association of private sector companies in Bhutan who are involved in, I mean, they're earning profit and so on, but they're also trying to get the development work done. And so by working with BNCCI, we're in a position to actually help share the knowledge that needs to be done either from the central government to companies that operate outside Thimphu, for example. So that notion of sharing knowledge and to be transferred within a country among companies and then outside in the region is something that is being built upon in terms of our work and in terms of the work of the PSOD. And I'll be able to share with you a few other examples of what we've done in the private sector in different countries, and also the sense there really being, how can we actually get this to be transferred to others? And I'll give you an example later on about what somebody that's very well known to all of us over here said about what works and what doesn't work, but I'll stop over here for now.
Okay, that was a teaser, so that we're excited about next round. But yeah, let's go to the next round of questions about more concrete examples of what we mean by the contribution of the private sector in knowledge sharing. We're actually not talking necessarily about adding another responsibility to the private sector that would be of knowledge sharing, but it's just talking about the fact that by just doing their day-to-day work, by trading, by investing, by training their staff, by managing their staff, by investing in other countries, the private sector or private companies are actually contributing to the knowledge sharing in a big way. And we'd like to have some concrete examples now from our panelists with a different perspective. I will ask Shuri again to give first the perspective of the private sector itself. You've been working in this company for a few years now, and it's covering a variety of sectors, technology, human capital, also across continents, Africa, of course India, because that's the headquarters, but Africa, Europe, Southeast Asia. So what type of concrete examples could you share with us to explain how your company has been contributing to South-South knowledge sharing?
Okay, 3-4 examples of points which comes to my mind. One, of course, is in line of the PPP that we are talking about. So India being again a resource constraining environment when we started 30 years back, infrastructure needed urgent intervention and there was not enough money. As you had rightly indicated that the amount of money which is required to develop the infrastructure in this region. So we came up with this concept of build, operate, own, transfer in India for the first time. And so one of very big road project in India but got financed. We invested upfront. We designed and got the investment, and it's a long-term lease concession for 20-25 years where the users of the road actually started paying for it. So we cross-fertilized this concept in other core sectors like maritime infrastructure, airports, bridges, tunnel roads, so on and so forth. In that process, we actually took this knowledge and this model to several of our African countries, some of the European countries like Spain, Latin America, and we actually acquired another entity so that we can build on that network, and we are diversifying into renewable energy and so on and so forth. So there are examples that I can take on the core infrastructure part. Another quite diverse is we also work, we have an education technology arm, and we wanted to solve the crisis of improving learning outcomes in Indian schools, and in that process we stumbled upon a prototype device created by one IIT, Indian Institute of Technology professor, for his own innovation. We actually liked the concept, invested money, took it to production, and it actually converts any classroom into an interactive digital learning environment. So it's called KYAN, knowledge and yarn as a Sanskrit for vehicle. So that device now actually sits in about 50,000 schools in India. And now we have slowly started, I was talking to the lady from Nigeria, that we have started a pilot project in Jigawa, taking the same concept of interactive portable solution. And so that wherever there is a deficiency in teacher capacity, this acts as a very good solution. And not only in Africa, but also pilots have started in Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and I'm sure we will expand. Of course, Philippines, we have done already quite significant work. Another challenge in the social infrastructure space, it comes to my mind, is the problem of India actually is perceived to be reaping the dividend of young population. So the entire world is aging while there is a large, but the scenario is such, it's not homogeneous. It's also a disaster situation where large number of youth are neither in employment nor in education or training. It's called NEET category. And actually, government and private sector joined hands, created a PPP model called National Skills Development Corporation, through which they adopted one of our models of demand-driven short duration skills training program attached to livelihoods and employment. So that is something which has worked in scale, and we are getting requests from other African countries to advise on how to go about and transform the TVET sector. We have started our work in Africa, and specifically on 7 African countries like Burkina Faso and Uganda, Nigeria, so on and so forth, on technical assistance on cotton farmers' livelihood development program. So that kind of knowledge sharing and exchange is 3-4 examples I can think of. And of course, today's day is digital. So we are also trying to transform and we want to go completely digital with our K-12 and TVET education services. So here we are collaborating with a large number of private content providers and technology partners like Google and IBM Watson for education to make available the entire learning content for K-12 and TVET skilling content available to all the South countries. And we want to put it in a freemium model. The basic learning has to be free. It has to be accessible to the learner anytime, anywhere kind of thing. It's a device agnostic kind of environment. I'd be happy to share more of that intervention as we go along. So these are the 4-5 examples that I can think of.
Well, those are really interesting examples on several levels, actually. First, but because it's showing how the private sector is bringing one technology or one know-how from one country to another. And second, also because the last example is also how private sector can find some benefits and some business case in developing activities that are more of public goods that used to be considered as the territory of the public sector. Did you find that the fact that you are a company from India, so from the South, did you find it an advantage? Because we have to all acknowledge that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it might have been a disadvantage, being considered as not as trustworthy as a company from the North. But of course, it has changed a lot, and now it's becoming more and more common. So do you see this trend too?
Credit has to be given to the current government for perception management to a large extent. And also what has happened is the last couple of decades has been really, really good for India in terms of its monetary policy opening up and investments being made on primary education. We actually started investing in higher education. That was one of our fallacy. So we changed courses. And what is good about India, if a solution works in India, so it will work at some scale. It is very diverse in terms of geography, language, culture, ethnicity. So if you can crack a problem in India, chances are reasonable success of, chances of success are there in other South countries. So I would say that people are now much more open to adopt certain areas.
That's great to hear. I will turn now to Q1 about the examples of public-private partnerships. Those are obvious examples where we see how the public and the private sector can work together to share knowledge, technology, and know-how. Can you give us some examples from Korea? And I think you have slides that you would like to show.
Yes, I have prepared for some slides. And maybe, yes, that's the first slide. Thank you very much. And so I will give some very brief the introduction of how the Korean BTO type of PPP is organized in Korea, and gave us one specific examples about that. And so this is some general scheme of the BTO. So you may, on the left side of the slide, you may see the Incheon Bridge. You may have seen it when you travel from the Incheon airport to Korea, to Seoul. And this is actually the PPP project. And the BTO project is the very frequently used type of the PPP in Korea. So the build means that it is constructed by the private company, the special purpose company, and after that the facility will be transferred to the government. So that represents the transfer part. And after that the private companies are given a concession of the operational right for a specific time period, and the private companies collect the revenues from the user fee. That's the operate part. So this is some general scheme. And can you please next slide? Okay. So now I'll give a very specific example of the Korean PPP project. This is the Seoul Metropolitan area landfill gas resource project. So on the left side, it is a little bit blurred, but you can see some large dumping, waste dumping site in Korea. It's the western part of the Seoul, and it was very huge waste dumping site. And after the utility, the facility was ended, and the government wanted to manage the waste and also utilize the resources that come from this waste very effectively. So government made an agreement with the private parties which can utilize the landfill gas from the waste and generate the powers from them. So on the left side you can see from this project the public and the government can benefit from better waste management, and on the side of the neighboring people they can enjoy a better the environment. So on the private side they get some revenues from this facility. So this is one typical example of how the public and the private parties in the PPP project can benefit simultaneously from the project. And surely each country has different type of PPP schemes and different experiences. I think that sharing these experiences and knowledge on PPP project can also benefit many participants in this event. So.
Thank you. Very good examples of how knowledge can be exchanged, shared, but also generated by this partnership between the public and the private sector, and how there could be demand for exporting this know-how in other countries. I will turn to now the representative of the government side, Rahman, and ask you a few questions about your experience on, more specifically in Bangladesh, on maybe also the transfer of know-how and knowledge that's done through experts coming from different countries, working in the private sector or for the government in developing policy reforms for supporting the private sector. And you mentioned the garment sector. There is also the energy sectors. Could you give us some examples of how that works?
Thank you. I'll be more specific this time. Now, the thing is that Bangladesh is a small country, but with a large population. So there are different types of cars that you would find in Bangladesh: Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Malaysian, European. So you can almost bring anything into Bangladesh. Now the thing is that the present government recently started thinking over our own car manufacturing, and a South Korean company with some private sector entrepreneur in Bangladesh has set up a plant, and the first lot of production are expected to come in 2019. So we'll be having our own version of car that India started at a time. Now there is one other thing, like very often the important things are neglected. For an example, agriculture is the backbone, and still even if it is not a greater portion of the GDP, but still it helps us a lot. Now in agro-based industries, Malaysia, Thailand and other technologies are pouring into Bangladesh in different products and food products, and basically the greatest success has been achieved in the field of fisheries, because Bangladesh exports fisheries. Previously in the export basket it was only shrimp, but recently the export basket is diversified, and we have become, in terms of internal sweetwater fish, fourth, and seawater fish fifth. So worldwide, this is a tremendous achievement for Bangladesh because of its little land boundary. The other thing is that, of course, RMG is a fact, and we can't deny. Now, one interesting example is can be found in Bangladesh. The Bangladesh RMG has direct relation with, for an example, in terms of machineries and technology transfer and human development. We have experts from India, machineries from China and Europe, and Sri Lankan experts also are working there. And the recent trend is that the Bangladeshi investment is going into Myanmar in the RMG sector. So maybe in next 10 years, who knows, Myanmar would be a rising RMG sector exporter as well. So this is a good example of South-South cooperation. So other than these, there are a number of sectors like leather and electronics and ICT as well, where Bangladesh has started entering the manufacturing space. So these are some examples, specific examples, where we might have a good future. And mostly these technologies are transferred, trainings are actually attained, and those are initiatives from the private sector, obviously with the help and with the guideline of the present government, and they're doing quite well. So maybe we can hope that we see more success stories in the future other than RMG in the next 10, 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And the RMG, the ready-made garment sector, is actually a good example. It's definitely a sector in which you see South-South investment. In Bangladesh, as you say, you have investment from China, from Korea, from Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, you see also investors from India. In Cambodia, you see investors from China, from Thailand, from Vietnam. So it's really a sector where there is already a lot of exchange that has happened within the countries, South-South. And that actually brings not only new technology, but it also brings new labor standards. And that's another sector. You mentioned the Rana tragedy earlier, with the collapse of the factory on the workers. But by this cross-fertilization and exchange of know-how and good practices among the private sector, there were also some good practices and standards that were developed to improve the standard of working for in all sectors, for Bangladesh especially. So that's a very interesting area. I will turn to Gambhir and examples from ADB on how the private sector can facilitate the knowledge sharing or how ADB can support the private sector in doing so.
Sorry. I think one of the main things we have to keep in mind as we listen to the examples being given over here about the experiences that the private sector might have in one country and how they can be transferred over. There's a really nice story that I have to tell you because this is a true story. The former Prime Minister of Singapore was once, as he was traveling to a particular country, and the reporters actually asked him a particular question, and he actually said, if I were to let you run my country, you would bring it to the ground. And that was, taken with some surprise. Do you know which country he was referring to? Australia. He actually said, if I let the Australians run Singapore, you would drive it to the ground. Now, Australia is a developed country, and so is Singapore. So you would think that the lessons that, that whatever it was that Australia was doing would have been transferred over to Singapore. But the point there is the English phrase, what's sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander. They're two different things. You have to look at the country context. Now, and we have to be aware of the same thing as well with respect to what we're talking about on knowledge sharing. It might be with respect to South-South, and you would think that the conditions are more or less the same. But they actually are quite different. You have to keep that in mind. So the examples, for example, with respect to what the ADB has been doing. There are three different types of financing that the private sector normally, our support is normally, sort of given. There's trade financing, which is largely for small businesses that they need the financing in a very quick turnaround time. And there have been projects in Afghanistan on rural business where the private sector has done a project to actually allow for the financing for small businesses. There's a separate business line on financing for SMEs, because in most of the countries as they progress, it's the SMEs that actually sustain the economy, the small and medium enterprises. And indeed in Asia Pacific, the ADB has said that there are only two low-income countries, Afghanistan and Nepal. All the others are either lower middle income or upper middle income. And therefore, a middle income country has a different way in which things get done. So you need to start thinking differently about how to engage the private sector in these places. But in terms of the SME financing, in Kyrgyz Republic, Pakistan, India, there's any number of projects that the private sector operations department has done to actually allow for financing for SMEs. And then of course there's the upper end big projects that we're involved in. So in Azerbaijan, the Shah Deniz gas field project is $1 billion worth of lending, 500 million as a non-sovereign loan, and $500 million as partial credit guarantee. And those are also some of the examples that, the assumption is that you can see what the private sector has learned from there, and then, transfer it over to, let's say, India, where there might be, a solar power project, which actually starts looking at the big scale of investments that we're talking about. One of the things that we've actually also come to notice is that there's a lot to learn from the private sector as it would apply in the government side of things. So increasingly these days, those of you that work in state-owned enterprises, the nature of business in SOEs is changing now. There are countries where SOEs are extremely powerful, they're rich, they've got a very good balance sheet, they can actually borrow money based on their balance sheet. They don't need to have anybody stand as a guarantor. Now what ADB normally does is when we give loans to SOEs, we ask the government, the sovereign, to actually stand as a guarantee. Just in case there's a default, we can actually get the money back. But there are countries that have actually said to ADB, we're not going to stand as guarantors anymore for big SOEs that are wanting to borrow money. Examples, Power Grid in India, PLN in Indonesia, there's those in Vietnam, in Kazakhstan, Samruk Khazanah. If Samruk Khazanah wants to borrow money from ADB, $1 billion, why should the government of Kazakhstan stand as a guarantor? Because they have a very healthy balance sheet. So what that means is that you then have to go back and look at the nature of the SOE. Those are the good examples. There are any number of other SOEs in these countries which are actually on a sustained basis a drain on the economy. We have colleagues from Nepal over here, and you'll be able to to verify this. The Nepal Electricity Authority, every year it has been in business, it has run on a loss. Every single year. And yet Nepal has tremendous amount of hydropower. Every year it runs on a loss, and every year government gives it subsidies. So the government is getting whammed from all sides. It's giving subsidies, so it's losing the money. There are no profits, therefore it gets no dividends back from the company. There's all kinds of corruption that could take place. I'm not saying there is, I'm just saying that it's mismanagement of resources. There's no benefit whatsoever to the government to have money invested in Nepal Electricity Authority. But yet they do it. There might be a political reason for it. Let's not go down that road. But what we've come to realize is that from the private sector, we have come to learn that if you have good corporate governance practices, as they have in many of these companies, you could actually have the SOEs managed better. Because in many countries, governments are loath to actually corporatize or privatize companies, which is fair enough. That's their prerogative, and they can think the way they want to think. What we're saying is that maybe we can learn from how the private sector is doing things. So we do actually have a program right now where the governance thematic group, the group I used to head that group before, and on the sovereign side, we work with the private sector people to find out what kind of projects do they have on corporate governance, so that we can take these standards and see how we can apply them to SOEs. And that's a very different, unique way of thinking about it, because all of a sudden now we're telling SOEs that you need to do things differently in terms of the governance, because the way the mismanagement actually occurs is because the corporate governance standards are not very high in these SOEs. So the learning takes place both ways is what I'm trying to say. It's among countries. So if the Pacific private sector initiative has 14 different countries, and from Tuvalu and from Cook Islands and Vanuatu and Tonga, and to see how they can learn from each other, but also from the public sector to the private sector, to the government, sorry. And the biggest thing that we think will happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years is that governments will continue to use state-owned enterprises to run their business. And unless they change their corporate governance standards, things are not going to improve at all. And on that one, I think we've got a lot to learn from the private sector. Now, not everything, of course, can be done exactly the way it's done in the private sector, but I think we need to start doing things differently about setting up these corporate governance standards.
Thank you for all these examples, Gambia. Before I go to the third round of question on looking forward, I have a few questions here from Pigeonhole. One is interesting. It's about it's about the motivation for the private sector. Aside from profit, what is the driver for the private sector to share their knowledge? And what about intellectual property rights or property issues? Does that question inspire one of you? From the private sector perspective?
I also had that same question. But it's a question of incentivizing contribution of knowledge. If there is no incentive, there will be no sharing, because IP is everything for private sector. But if there is a way in which you actually gain by sharing, I'm sure that there are methods. I can take an example of Swiss challenge method of procurement. That's quite an innovative way by a private sector to share IP. If you want to have a large contract, if you want to work with governments, and if you have an innovative idea, government actually allows you through this Swiss challenge method, you share the idea and you get the first right of refusal for execution of that project. So that's a good way of incentivizing. Like this, I'm sure there are several aspects which we can think of.
I think that's a good summary, is that actually you need incentive to have knowledge sharing. I think if it's true for the private sector, it's also true for all of us and for the public sector or anyone sharing profit. Anyone wants to have a try at that?
I would like to add, it's not always a matter of profit or incentive. There are other things as well. For an example, a private entrepreneur, if wants to set up a business, it requires land, a big investment. Now, Bangladesh has been, in a planned way, has been establishing export processing zones with bilateral relations, collaborating with different countries. There is a Korean EPZ in Chittagong. There is other EPZs with other countries. So, and there are EPZs where the government facilitates with land, electricity, and other infrastructure by constructing roads, giving link with a port. So these are the facilities where the ready plots can be availed by the private sector. So the only thing they have to do is they have to come up with a venture. So that's the thing, and this is quite encouraging and bringing FDI. And even if EPZs are still at the initial stages, but there are a number of EPZs which has been working quite nicely. So that's one particular thing that government can do, and government can make the way. So that's might be other solutions as well for encouraging private sector.
Thank you. There is another question that's more on public-private partnerships and examples of synergy that were developed through public-private partnerships. So maybe, well, you gave a few examples. You want to elaborate, and maybe some examples from ADB or from Bangladesh on PPPs.
Yes, actually, I don't have any specific examples, but actually the realization of the actual PPP is already the result of the synergy between public and private parties. And so in many cases, the realization of the project is in the way of the finding some creative solutions, how to tackle the specific tasks that we have in the real world. So in that way, we can achieve some synergies from different parties.
Raman?
There are already some successful examples like quick power rental in the energy sector in Bangladesh, where PPP is a success, and the success is also extended in other field as well. for an example, in ICT and in other ventures as well. So maybe in next 10 years, there would be more PPPs coming and more success stories would be from this part of the globe.
Thank you. Maybe Gambhir, I know that ADB is part of a network also promoting examples or knowledge coming from public-private partnerships. Do you have any information on that? Or?
Well, I'm not sure if I have any information on that, but what I recall one particular the time, there was about 2007 or so, I was doing a technical assistance project for what the project was called mainstreaming PPPs in India at the state level. It was very interesting because we actually went to the Ministry of Finance, the DEA, the Department of Economic Affairs. Arvind Mayaram was the Joint Secretary at that time, and we went to 3 different cities in Mumbai, Calcutta, and Goa. And we talked to in a room like this, we actually brought in the private sector people, and to a person, they said, we're ready to come into this, but we don't think the government is. And if you look at the assessments of PPPs across the world, wherever they have failed because largely, and I'm not saying this is across the board, they have failed where the government is not actually up to speed with the private sector. The private sector says, look, we have the funding, we have the ideas, but we don't think the right conditions are in place for us to come in and work with you. And if the government officials who are part of this PPP project are not actually aware of the issues, they are not really skilled in terms of what's required to be actually managing these PPPs, they're going to be taken for a ride. And in return, the private sector is not going to be actually getting what it is supposed to get from these PPPs. So there's a danger there of actually overhyping PPPs as the best way forward. Now, mind you, this is something that in our strategy 2030, the ADB is coming up with a new strategy now. It's been approved by the board on end of July. It will be formally approved. And there's a lot. If you look at it, probably the largest dimension of that strategy is working with the private sector, because we clearly realize that the government cannot and should not do everything. And therefore, how do you bring in the private sector? And of course, PPPs is one such way of doing it. There's probably a network of individuals and entities that ADB is involved with, but I'm not aware of them. But the point is that we have to be very careful about how we sell this idea of PPPs. It's not all just gung-ho. There are things that could go wrong and have gone wrong in many of these projects. But the governments themselves need to be aware of what is it that they need to create the right conditions. And a large part of the sovereign side of the work that we do is in creating the conditions for the private sector to come in. It might be, let's say, reducing the cost of doing business. It might be actually changing the regulatory framework so that the private sector can come in and actually help do things better. It might be that it takes you, instead of 4 months to get your license, it takes you 10 days. I'm just out of curiosity, because I used to be with the government in New Zealand, and there they say it takes you about an hour to register your company. An hour.
That's
online.
True in Mauritius. I've done it.
Yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
See, now can you imagine if in countries like Afghanistan and Laos and Cambodia and Nepal and all that, I don't know how long it takes in Nepal or in Cambodia or in Afghanistan. A month and a half, or do you have to give any money to anybody? But it actually takes you an hour to register a company in New Zealand. So the point being that the government has to create the right conditions so that the private sector can feel that it is amenable for it to do business. So that's our part of the work. The sovereign side of it is to actually make sure that we're creating the conditions. We work with organizations like SEBON, the Stock Exchange Board of Nepal, for example. The same thing in Bangladesh too, where we're working with them so that we are helping create the right conditions for the private sector to feel that there is some merit in coming and being part of it. But of course, PPP projects are much more complex than that. But then that's more or less the side of the story that I thought we should talk about.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me come to the last round of questions, which is really looking forward. How can we improve this knowledge sharing, and how can we involve the private sector more? How can the private sector be in an environment that's actually not preventing him from sharing knowledge, but on the contrary, supporting this knowledge sharing? So maybe I will turn to Kiwan first and ask you, Kiwan, about the example of Korea. Korea, as we've been talking since this morning, has a lot to share, a lot of examples, including from the private sector, knowledge coming from the experience of the private sector here in the last decades. What is the plan? Actually, is that do you see that being a trend of exporting the knowledge, exporting the know-how and intelligence from past experiences in Korea to other countries?
Yes, thank you, Veronique. Actually, the KDI has been engaging a lot of the knowledge sharing and also the partnership project with many developing countries. And when I meet many people, government officials from developing countries, they are very interested in Korean cases, and they say that the Korea has still the memory of the development, and that is some very important thing, that we still know the period of the trial and errors and how we overcame the specific tasks and challenges, and how we achieve the specific developmental paths. And so that's the way the Korea can communicate with many other developing countries. But I'm not saying that the Korean case and Korean example is the so-called silver bullet. And so we have still our own challenges and problems, and so we have a lot of things to learn from the experiences of other countries. So that's very important lessons that we are always expecting from other countries. I have focused my intervention in terms of the infrastructure PPP, but actually, if you think about the general type of the policies, you need to developmental project. So many projects are already the type of PPPs, and it can only be achieved by the partnership between public and private parties. And so I think that two things are very important in regarding the PPPs. And so one is that each country has specific conditions and very specific set of the experiences and knowledges regarding PPP, as well as implementing the specific the policy project. So this is the reason why we need more and more this type of the knowledge sharing events, where these different experiences are shared across countries, and each country gets some intuitions and also very good motivations for the future challenges and solutions. And so that's the importance of knowledge sharing. And in this way, more private parties, if necessary, can be integrated in the event, that so that some the creative solutions from the private parties can be transferred to many countries. The second point that I would like to emphasize is that the importance of capacity buildings. So as already mentioned by the previous speakers, that the private parties, private companies have already the solutions, but in many cases it is very difficult to be implemented by the lack of the capacities on the side of the government, both at the national or the subnational levels. So this is the reason why we need strengthen the capacity building opportunities to many government officials from the countries. And I think that MDBs can provide a very sound platform where each country South-South collaboration can take place. And also we can put forward more bilateral collaborations between, for example, South Korea and other developing countries, where the advantages and experiences of each country are shared. So that's my observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And remaining on this perspective of the government, I will turn to Raman and ask Raman, what is your impression of what could be done to foster this knowledge sharing coming from the private sector? It could be in terms of cross-fertilization, of transfer of technology, skill development in any sector.
Private sector is doing well in almost all the developing countries. Now the thing is that it has come a time when we need greater cooperation. For an example, South-South is a term, and it had been a term, but until very recently we see South-South cooperation in a much realistic form, taking shape through different projects and different success stories. Now similarly, if developing countries can come together, keeping aside the government, for a greater cooperation. That cooperation might be in the individual level or their own level with their own initiatives. So when technology and investment can run borderless, can help each other, can complement each other, so then the success would be in a greater scale. So all I think is think of a greater platform, a common platform for the South-South blocks for sharing their experience, investment, technology, training, so that they can help each other for a mutual beneficial relationship.
Thank you. I'll turn to Gambhir rapidly, but you mentioned the strategy 2030 that ADB is putting in place. The fact also that ADB has a vision of becoming a knowledge bank, that it's putting a lot of emphasis on innovation, technology, and private sector. So what do you think can be the role of an MDB like ADB in the future for supporting this transfer of know-how?
Okay. The term knowledge bank, you mentioned that, but it's almost very pejorative because long ago the World Bank called itself a knowledge bank, and there's any amount of academic literature, not just, and Marvin's here, so you will correct me if I'm wrong. There is academic literature that shows that the World Bank is not and has not been a knowledge bank, and I think they've tried to stay away from that particular nomenclature, and it's not something that we've basically said we will be doing. However, having said that, the strategy 2030 is actually very clear about how we should move forward with respect to the private sector. We call it an integrated approach to doing things. Now, earlier this morning, you heard from our Director General Wu Chong about how we will, sort of work in terms of the sharing the knowledge and everything. The integrated approach actually talks about how we work with the private sector in terms of how we move forward. So, for whatever projects we do, and we're not, the point that Wu Chong was making, we're not a commercial bank. We don't just give out money as a loan and say, okay, here's a 7%, it's at 7% interest, and you pay it back within 3-4 years. We're a development bank. There's a very substantial difference. So here's how it might work for any particular project that you have in mind. There is, for almost everything that you want to do, there's probably a need for a policy reform. So if you're going to do, this particular project you want to work on, it might be that you have to change some foreign exchange rules and regulations. And there might be a policy that might need to be changed. And that's something that ADB will come on the sovereign side of things. We work with the governments. It might be with the central bank. It might be with the Ministry of Finance. It might be with others. Okay, so that's something that the sovereign side will do. ADB also has a private sector representation. We have an Office of Public-Private Partnerships, which is now increasingly working on transaction services, on helping the governments actually design the projects, come up with the projects. So that we're offering that as the service that we would work with the government and the private sector. And of course, there's investments that the private sector will make, either as a loan or as equity in a particular company, as has happened in Vietnam. There's recently, $25–30 million equity that was gone into a company, and it has worked so well that now they're talking about actually using South-South learning with respect to seeing it being done in Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and so on. There's also viability gap funding. In certain instances, you do need, there to be a funder that actually comes in and takes care of the viability gap of projects that are being very innovative, and you may not necessarily come up with the right kind of funding in the beginning. We provide guarantees. We mentioned about the Shah Deniz, case in Azerbaijan. By ADB providing the guarantee of a particular loan that a company might take in that country, that there is more credibility, there's more comfort that there is something, actually there's a guarantee that the ADB is providing, therefore there should be more funding coming in. And finally, there's technical assistance. We do come in with technical assistance. Last year we spent about $200 million of TASF, Technical Assistance Support Fund, of ADB's money, $200 million for technical assistance to countries to actually start being able to do the work that the project requires, to help build capacity and so on. Now, all of that is encapsulated in the term integrated approach. We feel that there's one thing for the private sector to say we're going to go and invest money in this particular project, and if they've done the due diligence and they've done the math and it all adds up, then by all means go ahead and do it. But if there is a very strong, and this is very clearly mentioned in our Strategy 2030 document, there are times when you do need to be involved in a particular project because the value added for the community is substantial. In the social sectors, for example, then we will come up with an integrated approach where there's a sovereign side of the work that will take care of the policy reforms and the technical assistance, and the private sector will then come in and work on the equity and the loans and so on. So we think that's in the next 10, 12, 15 years, that's probably the way to go with respect to bringing in the private sector much more into the development stream of work.
Well, thank you very much, and I will turn to the private sector. You've heard the three other speakers. So what do you think? Do you think that's going to help? Is that, what else would be needed actually for the private sector to be even more involved in this transfer of know-how?
I think all the suggestions are very useful, and the advantage of speaking last is everything is covered. Just couple of points which you may think of. It's not specific solution. One is today information is free to an extent. Lot of knowledge is also free. You Google it, other than China, but and similar search engines. So, but what is premium is knowledge to a large extent, and if we don't democratize knowledge, we will create another kind of divide in the larger society. So, we'll have to really think through what needs to be done to make this happen. Second is, can we think of a slightly more permanent structure of creating a knowledge exchange in a true public-private partnership mode, where both private sector and public sector, private sector, everybody actually creates this physical knowledge exchange, can be anchored by MDBs like ADB, and create the subsequent down the line, ecosystem. If the knowledge exchange is the hub, you create a similar system in all your member countries. That system in turn networks with private, public, academic, all the sectors, so that knowledge flows both from bottom up and top down. If we can think of such a structure, I think everybody will be more excited to play. Third aspect is we still quote statistics, we still quote numbers which are easily available today, which means that our education system perhaps needs a little bit of tweak and change. The world is moving. We really don't know 5-10 years down the line how much of robotics will replace the kind of entry-level work that we are doing. It has already started happening. So are we revisiting and revitalizing our school curriculum, or providing the necessary new economy workforce skills, or the basic coping skills which are required for our youth to succeed as they go along? So that's one area where we need some intervention. Fourth, of course, is I think it has been covered by you very well in the governance aspect of it. End of the day, everything will boil down to good governance and better administration. Otherwise, everything will fall flat. So if we can actually look at building large-scale capacity building initiative of all the government employees across the rank and board. It has worked in few states in India, where we have seen states which have adopted this policy are progressing far better than their other counterparts. So these are 4 or 5 areas, I think, where we can look ahead.
Thank you. Very good ideas. And we're running out of time, but I will still take the time to ask if there is one question in the audience other than the pigeonhole. Okay, 2 questions then. Short answers, please.
While appreciating the contribution of private sector and also the partnership between public sector and private sector, there are also challenges which need to be kind of shared, especially from the point of public. Like when you do this roads, highways, build, operate and hand over. But there is a kind of challenge and public concern. How many years you operate, how much you collect, what is the money spent, who will, this knowledge is not there. The transparency is not there. So that is something, how do you really kind of look at it? And we need to have that kind of knowledge. That is one. Second thing is that, we need to also bring in the knowledge from the point of the emerging sector, that is social enterprises. Social enterprises which has more people-centered development. Like you talk about like BRAC in a big way in Bangladesh, they have gone into these social enterprises, they have been able to generate 80% of their money from the social enterprises for development-centered kind of work. So that is also a kind of knowledge we need to be kind of sharing here.
Thank you, and I will take the second question before I ask our panelists to react to this.
I have many questions, but I mean, if I have to choose one, the question goes to Mr. Chatterjee. You talked about the technology that your company has invested in, transforming a classroom into a digital learning lab. What is the role of the teacher or teachers in the new technology environment? Does it replace them? Does it empower them? Does your company have additional interventions to work with the teachers? How does it work?
Thank you. So maybe we can start with that question, the last one, which is very specific about the role of teachers in your example.
Very good question, sir. This has been developed as a teaching tool. So at no point in time we are suggesting that we replace teachers. It's the teachers who uses the technology to teach in the classroom. In that process, his or her own capacity gets built, and it is completely driven and led by teachers, and the entire capacity building program of teachers is centered around that. And it's made in a manner which is very simple to use. Otherwise, if you make it very complex, then the teachers will have, okay, fantastic, then let's lie there. So it's on the usage.
Thank you. About the challenges and of transparency and also social entrepreneurship.
Yes, I'll the answer about the question about the concerns about the PPPs, and actually in case of Korea, we have also some concerns about the way that the PPP project is managed. And so, for example, in early days, and we had some failures in the future demand forecast, and so, and also some usually the private the PPP project has toll roads have a little bit more higher prices compared to the public roads. So this is some of the complaints from the public side. But as I already mentioned, that the PPP in itself is finding some solutions and some balancing between public and private side. And so also it involves the risk allocation between different parties. So there is no direct answer, but you have to find the specific solutions to the specific project where this kind of concerns and the risk allocation is well managed between different parties. And actually, on the social infrastructure, actually in Korea we have more focused on hard infrastructure, but I think that the demand on more the social infrastructure is increasing, not only in Korea but also in many the Asian countries, and this is also the way the areas that we should tackle in the future.
Social infrastructure and social enterprises, which actually are managed as with using a business model, but with some objectives that are more social. I think that we are running out of time, so unless there is an urgent comment that you would like to say, I think that I will actually close this session. Thank you very much for all of your experience and for sharing knowledge with us. Thank you very much.